Welcome to Flashpoints. I'm Jeff Pegues, joined as usual by CBS News senior national security analyst Juan Zarate. Thanks for being with us once again. Jeff. So the White House has acknowledged this mistake, and the president also said this was an operation within the guidelines of their counterterrorism operations that they've conducted for years.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Well, we'll have to find out a bit more about this, but I think clearly the president wants to demonstrate that these were legitimate strikes, they were legal, and that they were within the bounds of the policies that he's put forth.
Our initial assessment indicates that this operation was fully consistent with the guidelines under which we conduct counterterrorism efforts in the region.
But what this is going to do, Jeff, is raise questions as to how the drone program, targeted strikes, kinetic strikes are undertaken, and whether or not the policies and procedures that the president has laid out are being followed, and whether or not they're even feasible given the nature of this conflict.
And based on the intelligence that we had obtained at the time, including hundreds of hours of surveillance, we believed that this was an al-Qaeda compound.
Keep in mind, a couple of years ago, the president heightened the standard by which these kinds of strikes could be undertaken in the wake of a lot of controversy and criticism. There's a near certainty standard in two regards. It's important to note this. One, near certainty that there are non-combatants in the space. So you don't want to kill civilians inadvertently, and you want to be really sure of that. Secondly, that the targets you're actually targeting are there. Right? You can't just be taking random strikes at anything.
Yeah, but how do you get to that point? What kind of intelligence do you need to have, and how accurate can it be on a battlefield?
Well, that's the tricky part. And to have a near certainty standard, which is probably the highest standard you would have under U.S. law, whether in a court or otherwise, in the kinds of environments we're talking about, Western Pakistan, we talk about Yemen, Somalia, where you don't have clear visibility, you don't have necessarily boots on the ground, you have to rely on human sources and other means from the sky and otherwise to understand targets. That grows very difficult. And to put a dossier together that is perfect, that tells you everything you need to know about everything going on, is a really hard task. And so that's a challenge here. And I think one of the lessons is going to be, look, we've got to balance the risk of action here with the risk of inaction, because you have to say, what if the president didn't make this decision, or what if the strike didn't happen and these were individuals who were plotting against the West and were successful? So I think, as you raised, Jeff, it's a real interesting question as to whether or not we even have the kind of information that allows us to make these decisions, and whether or not, at the end of the day, the drone program becomes paralyzed because of the need for such certainty.
Well, and then that raises questions about what's the alternative, right? And the alternative is U.S. troops on the ground?
Well, that's potentially one alternative. The other strategy, and you see this playing out in the counterterrorism environment around the world, not just the threat from al-Qaeda, but the Islamic State, is can you rely on proxies on the ground for intelligence, for the boots on the ground, the folks like the Kurdish Peshmerga fighting the Islamic State, for example, or Saudi forces fighting in Yemen. And so the halfway house here is you then have to rely on others, to include the Pakistani military, to go out and clear places like North Waziristan, South Waziristan. And they've had a hard time doing that, and they've been bloodied in the past, and they haven't necessarily been willing to expend the resources that they need to do that. So, you know, it's a difficult question, because if you don't have these, there's a lot of criticism about their use, but if you don't have these, what do you do when you have information that al-Qaeda members are coalescing, gathering, potentially plotting? Do you just sit there and wait? And the answer from the Obama administration and the Bush administration has been, you don't wait for these attacks to fester. Imminence is defined broadly, and we're going to strike if we can.
And what about the strength of al-Qaeda? Losing strength, gaining strength?
Well, this strike is interesting because it reminds us that there is still a core al-Qaeda. You do still have Ayman al-Zawahiri, folks like Adam Gaddan, Ahmed Farouk, and others who are still part of the core, who are trying to machinate a global environment, trying to plot against the West. The reality is the threat from al-Qaeda is largely coming from its affiliates now. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, al-Shabaab in Somalia, proven deadly in the past. Boko Haram, which has now changed allegiance to the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in North Africa. And importantly, the Khorasan group, which is this caravan of Al-Qaeda core that's moved into Syria to plot against the West. And so the strength from Al-Qaeda has largely devolved to its outposts, and that's really where you're seeing the threat come from.
For Juan Zarate, I'm Jeff Pegues, and that is Flashpoints.